Thank you. Can I ask the public leaving the gallery to do so quietly, as the Parliament is still in session? And we're moving on to the next item of business, which is a members' business debate on motion 18772 in the name of George Adam on recognition for nuclear test veterans. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. And can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on George Adam to open the debate. Mr. Adam, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This whole debate was brought by myself to the Chamber on the back of being friends with a nuclear test veteran, Ken McGinley. And although he's not from Paisley, he's from Greater Paisley, he's from Johnston. And when I first met him as a teenager, he was a Labour. Ironically, there's no Labour members here, but he was a Labour local councillor at the time in Renfrew District Council. And I knew him from that. And then as the years go on, he's now a member of the Scottish National Party. And I see him regularly in my constituency office. He comes and tells me some of the stories of what he went through and the difficulty that him and other campaigners and other families have had to deal with after these tests that happened in Christmas Island. And the irony is not lost on me that we're here in the week up to Remembrance Day itself and Remembrance Sunday, that we're debating this, because I never set out to have the debate this week. It's just funny how fate kind of actually makes up for justice in many ways and balances it, because it's my belief in this week, when we are looking at remembering people who have given up their life and defended our nation in various conflicts, I also think that British nuclear test veterans have been completely forgotten. They've been forgotten by the nation, by the United Kingdom government, who were the ones that carried out these tests on them. And whether that was actually intentional policy on behalf of the British state, that's entirely for others to make that decision themselves. But many of these veterans are now very elderly, and many of them might actually be dead before they ever get to see justice. And for me, that's what's the most important part of this. These people and their families might not see justice while they're still alive. And we're talking about a state that effectively took young men in their national service from one end of the world to the other and dropped a nuclear bomb on them. That's how simple this is, just to see how it worked out and how it affected them and how they could function in, of all things, a nuclear battlefield. Now, to us, that seems complete madness. It seems like something that in the 21st century, it feels barbaric, and almost for a state to do it almost seems unbalanced. But who honestly in the 1950s thought this was a good idea? Who thought it was a good idea to drop that bomb on these people? It's not as if we hadn't seen the horrors of Hiroshima. It wasn't as if we hadn't known what could actually happen. But these young servicemen were used as guinea pigs by an uncaring, very distant government. And since then, many of these veterans have gone on to have very medical conditions that are connected with their time on that island. And their families have had to live through that. You know, this wasn't a case of an officer saying, today, gentlemen, we go into battle. Some of you may not come back and may be killed by the enemy. These were people who, in many cases, didn't know what was actually going on and literally had a nuclear bomb dropped on top of them, and they've had to live with that for the rest of their lives. And yes, I will do indeed.
I really thank Mr Adam for bringing this debate.
Sorry, I forgot to call you.
So,
I nearly called you Minister, but I don't know if I'm calling you that in this, so I'll call you Minister Kevin Stewart and hedge my bets.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I really thank Mr Adam for bringing this debate here today, because like him, I have constituents who are survivors of the nuclear tests. One of my constituents who have seen some of the radiation burns that the man has, which are quite horrific, and he has had to go through a lot in his life. He said to me that other countries have compensated their nuclear test victims. The UK has not. He feels that that is unjust. Does Mr Adam agree with my constituent? And do you think that these veterans need to be compensated now for what was done to them in the 50s and 60s.
I've been generous with intervention, knowing the protocols with ministers speaking in debates. That's why I've been a bit more generous. You'll make up your time, Mr Adam.
For very personal reasons, I actually agree, because I know Ken, I know what he's gone through, and he's explained to me that many of his colleagues and comrades have gone through as well, and their families, and I agree with everything that Mr Stewart just said there. But to get back to when Ken McGinley went to Christmas Island in 1958, this happened in 1958. This isn't ancient. You know, to my daughter, that might seem 100 years away, but this is not. This is in living memory that this happened. And if you look at the context of that, Presiding Officer, in the 6th of February, Manchester United were in a European Cup tie in Belgrade, and there was a Munich disaster with the plane crash then. And the 25th of February, ironically, in 1958, CND was launched while all this was going on. And the 1st of August, the first Carry On film, Carry On Sergeant, about army life, ironically, was launched as well. And Cliff Richard had his first #2 record in the UK chart, and his first American rock and roll type song that had been released by a British artist. But 19-year-old Ken, he was more interested in all of that than anything he was going on, because he thought, on numerous occasions, he said to me he was aware of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but he had no real knowledge about nuclear bombs. And for Ken and his comrades, it was like a boy's own adventure as they went to the other side of the world. The big thing for him was actually stopping off at Hawaii on the way over, because that was a different planet to a young man from Johnston. So he eventually went over there, and to this rock and roll generation, they effectively went over there. For them, there was so much. Being part of your national service was actually quite a cool thing then. Their king, the king of rock and roll himself, on that year had been conscripted to the US Army. They were living the same life as Elvis Presley. So for them, it was a completely different world to the world that we actually know it then. But the 25th of April, 1958, at 10:05 local time, a Valiant aircraft piloted by squadron leader Bob Bates dropped a bomb off the coast of Christmas Island. This was the largest British nuclear weapon ever tested, a 3-megaton monster. And Ken McGinley was a young sapper in the Royal Engineers, and he was posted in January 1958, and he spent 3 months building barracks and facilities for thousands of servicemen engaged in the thermonuclear test programme. This 3-megaton monster, as I said, was released as young Ken was 25 miles away on the beach. Ken was provided with white coveralls or overalls, as we all know, that helps you in a nuclear blast, and told to turn away and cover his eyes with his clenched fists. When he clenched his fist over his eyes, Presiding Officer, he's told all he could see was his skeleton as the bomb went off. And that was what it was. That's what happened to him in that day. And I've got a quote here from Ken where he says, "I think the bomb exploded at a lower level than anticipated because there was an awful lot of dirt flying about. After the explosion, we were instructed to turn and watch the mushroom cloud rise. We were then told to take off our overalls and place them in a pile. It began to rain. The rain was discoloured and fell in large, heavy drops. Men who I believe were scientists wearing white suits and distinctive hoods and large black goggles began shouting for us to take cover in the tents. It was at that time that I got my first taste of black rum. It was a tradition in the Navy to serve black rum in rainfall. I didn't like it at the time, and I've never liked it since. But we went off duty and we were ordered to kill the birds who had been injured by the explosion. Some were still flying about, but they were blind as their eyes were burnt out. We used pickaxe handles to kill the birds. I did not like doing this, but we had no choice because of the terrible condition that they were in." That happened to Ken when he was a 19-year-old boy. The trauma alone, having to deal with that, should have been enough to affect anyone. But, Presiding Officer, as I said at the very beginning, at this time we must remember our national service people who have suffered because of this, whether it be individuals, we talk at this time of year of individuals who stormed the beach at Normandy, or individuals that had to suffer in the trenches in the First World War. But I feel that these people are being forgotten by the British state. These people have been forgotten when they were used as guinea pigs. And the United Kingdom still does not acknowledge or recognise their plight, even though other nations have already done it. Presiding Officer, this is not only wrong, but it's a national embarrassment for us here in this country. It's time for us to listen to men like Ken McGinley and respect and acknowledge them. They need to do this. We need to do this soon before it's too late and they're no longer with us.
Thank you very much. I call Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Maurice Corrie. Mr Gibson, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I would first like to congratulate my colleague George Adam for securing debating time on this important subject. Back in 2011, I tried to submit a motion on this issue, but due to the ongoing case in the High Court at the time, it was deemed unacceptable under sub judice. However, I did write to the Secretary of State for Defence, Liam Fox, and Minister for Defence, Personnel Welfare and Veterans, Andrew Robotham, without success, and then contributed to Christina McKelvey's debate on this issue later that year. The very notion of nuclear testing is beyond the imagination of most of us. Indeed, it is hard to fully comprehend that such apocalyptic weapons were deployed while thousands of service personnel were instructed to watch without protective clothing. UK Cabinet papers released in 1985 under the 30-year rule revealed that in 1955, then Prime Minister Winston Churchill contemplated evacuating Scotland north of the Black Isle in order to test a nuclear device near Wick. Opposition from the Norwegian government, who were concerned about prevailing wind conditions, meant that this mad suggestion was thankfully never taken forward. However, between 1955 and 1963, the British government conducted secret nuclear tests at Maralinga in South Australia and on Christmas Island. Perhaps the most notorious of these was Operation Grapple Y in 1958, which is more than 100 times more powerful than the bombs which levelled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 2001, Dr. Sue Rabbit-Rolfe of University of Dundee uncovered evidence suggesting that troops had been instructed to walk across the sites within hours of detonation, exposing themselves to radioactive materials. This was later confirmed by the UK government, despite previous contradictory statements that no humans had been used in experiments related to nuclear weapons testing. Understandably, many surviving nuclear test veterans and their families believe that they have a compensation claim against the UK government. Tragically, the experience of UK test veterans is not unique, and during the Cold War, forces personnel from the United States, Canada, France, Russia and China took part in similar trials. However, service personnel from these nations were afforded decent compensation settlements by their governments. The UK is the only nuclear power to deny special recognition and compensation to its test veterans, which is a shame on them. While MOD maintains that service personnel suffered no ill effects as a result of these tests, evidence presented by veterans and their families to the contrary is compelling. Two-thirds of British Nuclear Test Veterans Association members died before the age of 60, and ionising radiation, a known mutagen, impacted on veterans' children and grandchildren in the form of physical deformities. Dr. Roth also completed a study in 1999 that found that of 2,261 children born to veterans, 39% were born with serious medical conditions, 14 times the national figure of 2.5%. Depleted uranium weapons were tested in Scotland, despite warnings from Ministry of Defence scientists that the contamination could never be cleared up. Secret government records give a fascinating insight into political manipulation and manoeuvring behind the scenes in the 1970s to ensure Scotland did not thwart MOD plans to test fire-depleted uranium munitions at Dundrennan military range near Kirkcudbright. An internal MOD memo from 1973 warned that test firing will leave parts of the range contaminated by very persistent dust, adding, "It will probably be impossible to remove this completely, and initial consideration of this fact is essential." Nevertheless, the MOD pursued its plans, opting instead to hide them. My inclination would not be to mention Kirkcudbright all at this stage, but to wait until we can point to accident-free experience in English ranges before tackling the Scots, wrote one senior official in 1979. Presiding Officer, Labour's Scottish Secretary of State at the time, Bruce Millan MP, protested to then Prime Minister Jim Callaghan that DU testing would compound the problems he was having with nationalists and environmentalists opposing Scotland becoming a nuclear dustbin. However, with regards to Scotland's nuclear veterans, we owe a sincere debt to those forced to take part in these tests, and their unique service must never be forgotten. I'm glad our Parliament continues to recognise this. The suffering of these victims has been ignored by previous Westminster governments and the MOD for too long. It's time UK ministers accept responsibility for the effects of its past policies and does the right thing for our nuclear veterans and their families.
Thank you very much. I call Maurice Corrie, to be followed by Mark Ruskell. Mr Corrie, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd also like to thank my colleague George Adam for bringing this very important motion to the Chamber. And I'd also like to comment on his actual motion, because I think it gives it in very graphic detail of what we're discussing today and the seriousness of it. Also, I'd like to pay tribute to Ken McGinley on his his experience of this, what really was quite an appalling situation. And I have met people. I served in the Argylls with a colleague whose father was an RAF person and was on that very plane, the Valiant you're talking about. And I know the problems he suffered, and we looked into it all the time, and that's going back 20, 30 years. But can I just say that those in the armed forces are some of the bravest men and women of our nation has to offer, and they're called upon often to make numerous personal sacrifices, in some cases the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of our nation. And whilst the gravity of these sacrifices vary, it does not lessen the significance nor the right that a veteran has to recognition and respect for their service. With the discovery of nuclear fission in the 1930s and the resulting events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the landscape of military weapon development was drastically changed, and the UK began to research and develop nuclear warheads in order to stay at the forefront of this emerging powerful technology. An enormous amount of resources was allocated to the operation in order to ensure that it was successful. This included the manpower of approximately 22,000 servicemen, which has already been mentioned, who fulfilled the tasks ranging from the construction of runways and camps to gathering radiation samples from mushroom clouds. It is very easy to forget about their service, and there were no combative battles fought and no soldiers killed by enemy fire. But this is an unacceptable justification on our part, what happened on Christmas Island those years ago. These individuals not only ensured the security of the nation during a particularly volatile and uncertain time, but they did so at great personal risk. And whilst the possible dangers of radiation were then acknowledged, the full impact of ionization radiation was not well understood. As we further progress into this nuclear age, more resources have been put forward towards researching this field and a deeper understanding developed. And unfortunately, hindsight is 2020, and there's no way for us to go back in time and provide nuclear test weapons with the necessary protection. Nuclear test veterans and necessary protection. But moving forward, there is much that can be done to support these veterans. And as I said before, there should be no question concerning the recognition of these veterans and the valiant work they did and, of course, what they deserve. They have done much on behalf of our nation, and I thank them very much deeply for it. But it should not stop at recognition alone. Action must be taken, and in the year 2011, the Armed Forces Covenant created the understanding that in return for the service and personal sacrifices provided by soldiers, sailors and airmen, we as a nation would ensure that they were sustained and rewarded in commensurate terms. This agreement to support veterans also includes their families, and in this case, on account of the nature of radiation, their future descendants. And obviously this has been highlighted in George Adams' motion. This can be done by providing these families with access to accurate information and specific guidance concerning health risks that have occurred and may occur in the future, or by helping these families understand the future impact of their husbands' and fathers' participation in nuclear tests, and provide the relative necessary support as technology advances and knowledge is gained, or ensuring that requests for compensation, both past and present, are given full investigation and consideration that they duly deserve. It is important to note that these suggestions only scratch the surface of what can be done for these men and their families. And I, as chairman of the cross-party group in this House for Armed Forces and Veterans Community, will undertake to look into this and again write to the Secretary of State Defence on behalf of the cross-party group as we build strength and be able to become more of a presence in this Parliament. And in conclusion, Presiding Officer, we must not forget the important sacrifices that our servicemen and women make on behalf of our nation and our duty to them in return. Let us not forget that our nuclear test veterans fulfilled their part more than 50 years ago, and it is now our turn to step up to the plate and offer support wherever we can. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Mark Ruskell to be followed by Tom Arthur. Mr Arthur is the last speaker in the open debate. Mr Ruskell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can also thank George Adam for bringing forward this debate, and can I say also for bringing that personal testimony of Ken McGinley into this chamber. I found it incredibly moving. I think it's one of the most moving testimonies I've ever heard, and those words are going to stay with me for a very long time. And of course, as as Mr. Adam points out, it's a time of year when we always turn our thoughts to those in the services who've made huge sacrifices. And while it's always heartening to see charitable fundraising to support our veterans, I'm always personally left with a sense of shame that our Ministry of Defence has done so little to support those who've given so much. From nuclear test veterans to the Gurkha soldiers, there are those who've suffered injustices and need our support. And as a country, we have got a responsibility, of course, to provide support and treatment for their injuries, their illnesses and their ill health. Now, the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association estimate that around 22,000 British servicemen, both military and merchant navy, were present for the various tests across the Operation Grapples and the American military's Operation Dominic. And these men, as we've heard already, some as young as 17 years old, were stationed as close as just 23 miles from the detonations and ordered to watch as the mushroom clouds rose and dispersed across the Christmas and Malden Islands. One veteran described as being able to see his bones through his skin. Another claimed that the flash was so bright it was like seeing a second sun. Now, these young men had no idea of the damage nuclear weapons of this kind would do to them. Of the estimated 22,000, around 1,500 are still alive today and still able to provide that testimony. And they've suffered from long-lasting health issues affected by cancers, weak bones, and countless other illnesses. And unfortunately for many of these men, the injustices of these tests have been inherited by their children and their grandchildren. We've already heard that 39% of nuclear test veterans' children were born with serious medical conditions. But partners of test veterans have also been 3 times more likely to suffer miscarriages, while children of test veterans have been 10 times more likely to have a birth defect. The ill health has even gone on to affect grandchildren. Now, as the motion mentions, to date, the UK is the only Western nuclear power that does not offer special recognition or compensation of its test veterans. Ken McGinley and Edward Egan sued the Ministry of Defence for damages, but were rejected. In 2012, over 1,000 test veterans were denied permission to sue the MOD by the UK Supreme Court on the grounds that too much time had elapsed since they became aware of their medical conditions. Despite the Ministry of Defence insistence that the ill health of these veterans is unrelated to nuclear tests, the governments of France, Australia, the US and Fiji are among the nations that offer formal recognition and varying levels of compensation to their atomic veterans. The UK has shamefully failed to provide accurate recognition or compensation to its veterans, thus failing in its most basic duty of care. The Veterans Association have campaigned since 1984 for recognition and compensation for those who participated in the test. And they do vital work offering support and aid to those veterans and their families. And their campaign requesting that the MOD provide a medal for test veterans is expected to be ruled on later this month. And I urge the MOD to do everything that it can, both to recognise their service, but also their ongoing struggle for injustice. Presiding Officer, nuclear bombs are devastating, indiscriminate, inhumane weapons which have no place in our society. Scotland's opposition to the Trident nuclear weapon system is well established. We can and we should lead the charge in creating a nuclear-free world. And I hope the MOD does the right thing and deliver justice for these servicemen.
Thank you. Now call Tom Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank my friend and colleague George Adam for bringing this debate to the Chamber. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to pay tribute and express my gratitude to veterans and serving personnel in Renfrewshire South, across Scotland and beyond, for their dedication and for their tireless work to keep us safe. I also want to thank George Adam for his recognition of my constituent and friend Ken McGinley. There's not much more that I can add to what George so eloquently said, but Ken is someone who has led a remarkable life, and his commitment and dedication to the cause of nuclear test veterans is one that I have the greatest deal of respect for, and I'm glad that his work has been recognised this afternoon in this debate. In George Adams' statement, he contextualised the events of 1958 very effectively, which reminds us that this is not some piece of far distant history remote from us. It is something that is very relevant that has happened, if not in our own lifetimes, then in the lifetime of our parents and grandparents. And it is something that lives with us to this day, with the ever-continuous presence and menace of nuclear weapons. The debate, as it has perhaps been characterised by some regarding compensation for nuclear test veterans, often focuses on the impact and effects of exposure to radiation. Now, I am not a clinician or an expert who can offer comment on that. I appreciate there is a different point of view between test veterans organisations and the UK Government. However, I think that rather misses the point, because fundamentally what nuclear test veterans were subject to was an exceptional set of circumstances. We have had accounts from nuclear test veterans shared with us today of the experience of witnessing a nuclear detonation, of having one's back to the explosion, fists clenched, and due to the intensity of the flash, being able to see the skeletal structure, the outline of blood vessels in one's hand. Ken described it to me as like having a 3-bar fire passed across your neck. Perhaps the most eloquent and poetic and chilling account of a nuclear detonation was that given by the father of the atomic bomb, Robert Oppenheimer, on witnessing the detonation of Trinity, the first nuclear device in 1945. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of the world," quoting from the Bhagavad Gita. Anyone subject to a nuclear test to witness the devastating impact, the chilling beauty, as some veterans have described it, no one can be subject to that experience and not be profoundly impacted for the remainder of one's life. No one could be subject to that and not have an increased risk of PTSD, of potential mental health conditions. No one could be subject to that, and regardless of whatever reassurances are being given, not have deep concerns for the impact the exposure to such an event could have upon their health. And that alone should be grounds for compensation. In the year 2000, the UK Government recognised the exceptional circumstances of prisoners of war in Japan during the Second World War, and an ex gratis sum of £10,000 was awarded to those survivors or their widows. And that was a correct decision, and it was in recognition of an exceptional set of circumstances. Nuclear test veterans are an exceptional set of veterans, and they should be recognised, and they should receive compensation.
Thank you very much. Now calling Graham Day to close the Government. Minister, please.
Presiding Officer, as ever, I'm grateful to George Adam for bringing this debate to the Chamber today and for the contributions of members. Can I also welcome the accidentally timely nature of the debate, given Remembrance Sunday, when we reflect upon the service and sacrifice of many generation falls this weekend. As part of that reflection, there must be a recognition both of the awful decision all those years ago to place British service personnel in harm's way as nuclear devices were tested, to treat them, as George Adams said, as guinea pigs, and to the hard work of groups representing and supporting nuclear test veterans across the decades since. George Adam and Tom Arthur have referenced one such individual in Ken McGinley. My ministerial colleague, Kevin Stewart, as we've heard, has been championing the cause of one of his constituents in Aberdeen. And I know that Christina McKelvey, who was with us earlier, did similarly, sadly for a constituent who's no longer with us. Despite the passage of time, there will be nuclear test veterans located in most, if not all, of our constituencies. Indeed, I was actually struck, preparing for this debate, that my dad did his national service in the 50s. Had circumstances been different, he could have been amongst the 20,000 plus personnel who were made to be present at these tests. And I suspect other colleagues might potentially have family members similarly caught up in this. So let me again thank George Adam for bringing this issue to the Chamber, as the timing is impeccable and the significance indisputable. and for his moving speech, I have to say. The Scottish Government is clear that where ill health is proven to be as a result of service in the armed forces, it's right that the UK Government provides adequate and appropriate compensation. And I'm aware that it's the right of any veteran who believes that they have suffered ill health due to service to apply for no-fault compensation under the War Pension Scheme. And of course, I would encourage them to do so. But I recognise that for this particular cohort, this is about more than compensation. It's also about acknowledgement that there were detrimental, serious detrimental consequences for some of them and what they were exposed to, and it's about justice. As we've heard today, more than 20,000 UK and Commonwealth personnel were involved in the UK's atmospheric nuclear weapons test programme in Australia and the South Pacific in the 50s and 60s. And although that was a long time ago, responsibility for proven detrimental consequences of involvement in that programme cannot and should not be ducked. To that end, the amassing of a robust, objective and undisputed evidence base, challenging as achieving that might be all these years on, is essential, because the two perspectives on this are so far apart. Doubt is cast by one side on the veracity and the reliability of the 1999 Health Service survey referred to in Mr Adams' motion, although there are other accepted international studies which governments have responded to appropriately, whilst the veterans have been left deeply disappointed and doubting of the findings of more recent domestic pieces of work. In the 1980s, scientists from the National Radiological Protection Board, which became part of the Health Protection Agency in 2005, established a study to investigate whether the radiation that UK personnel were exposed to during those tests had detrimentally affected their health. And those studies have continued to date without settling the issue, certainly from the perspective of the veterans and those supporting them. So I welcome the fact that in July 2018 a fourth study was commissioned by the MOD in order to bring the evidence completely up to date. Now, that study is still underway, and I believe it's planned that the results will be published sometime in the early to mid part of next year. And this will bring the studies on this to a current day perspective to the studies. Research will be there into the comparison of incidences of certain types of cancer between the veterans and a control group of the general population. And of course, I look forward to learning the results in due course. But I can understand entirely if those veterans concerned and their families will feel they've had enough of studies and that the undertaking of such is a delaying tactic. That said, in a few months' time, we should have a clearer picture and hopefully be embarking on a process that offers those concerned some long overdue degree of closure. All of that said, back in April of this year, I did write to Tobias Ellwood, the then Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Defence, People and Veterans, asking both for this government to be kept up to date on the progress of the study and that the possibility of expanding it to include the well-being of children was considered. I still await a reply from the UK government, although given ministerial reshuffles and the fact we now have a Westminster election, that may have contributed to the lack of a response. I certainly hope that's the reason for it. Presiding Officer, I won't be alone in being thankful that atmospheric nuclear testing is now a thing of the past for the vast majority of nations. However, recent activity in North Korea serves as a reminder to all of us that nuclear weapons remain an aspiration for many. What long past and recent years have taught us is that the world remains a dangerous and volatile place and that nuclear weapons have exacerbated, not improved that. The fact that many nations now possess the so-called nuclear deterrent has not discouraged the continued development of nuclear missile programmes by aspiring nuclear weapon states. Lessons still have not been learned. The Scottish Government, and I'm sure the majority of this Parliament, remains of the belief that there is no place for these dreadful and indiscriminate weapons and that they should be consigned to history where they belong. It's also clear, Presiding Officer, from the contributions, and I commend members for those contributions today, that the members of this Parliament are entirely understanding of the concerns of nuclear test veterans and the inexplicable, unforgivable nature of what they were exposed to. I want to thank all members again for their contributions, and particularly Mr Adam for providing the opportunity to air this hugely important issue today. Presiding Officer.
Thank you. That concludes the debate. Now suspend this meeting of Parliament till 2 o'clock.